What about a Chrysler van produced in Canada? What about a coat? You got a coat. What about a drink after work? What about a drink tonight? What about a fly who speaks? What about a golf game this weekend? What about a graduate student? What about a horror film? It'll be so exciting for tonight, Friday the 13th. What do you say? What about a little lunch up in the West End today? What about a little thing called marriage? What about a neon pink slug? What about a nice bottle of wine dinner? What about a nice bottle of wine with dinner? What about a pretty face and great body? What about a raise based on merit? What about a serial laugher like Bill Clinton? What about a subcompact? What about a trip to France? What about a walk? What about a woman showing up naked in a public place? What about accommodation in Singapore? What about after the class? What will you do? What about after we do it? What about air crew? Where are we on that? What about Al Gore? What about all that scar tissue around the implant? What about all that tormenting stuff that I did? What about all the other potentials that we aren't told about and never investigate? What about all we've talked about? What about Alps videos? What about an evening riverboat tour? What about animals? What about another cup of coffee? What about around 5? What about as we are walking, am I putting my arm around, just conversationally? What about bean soup? What about bed? What about being fair to me? What about blind people? What about breakfast? What about bringing up the wife? What about bungee jumping? What about buy new one? What about call waiting? What about carrying this in your backpack? What about chicken? What about China, which has reacted more forcefully? What about college majors? What about coming back? I'd like to come back at about 7 p.m. 7. What about coming with us? What about consulting a travel agency? What about criticism that she dresses too provocatively? What about cross-dressing? What about dinner at my place? What about DNA left on them? What about doing my gluts next? What about You didn't hear? What about enjoying art at home without going outside? What about expenses? Studying abroad is very expensive. What about experiments on animals in other fields? What about exploring neighborhood? What about falling down while chewing and walking? What about fame has surprised you? What about first off being an American? What about fish? What about getting help if I have any problems? What about getting up earlier? What about giraffes? What about giving away your fortune? What about giving me a chance? What about giving us a chance? What about Glenn? He could be a Glenn. What about going around to Sally's tonight? What about going down to my hometown on New Year's Day? What about going downtown and eat out there? What about going fishing? What about going on a picnic? What about going out for lunch? What about going out with me tomorrow? What about going to a movie this evening? What about going to a nightclub in Shinchan? What about going to buffet for the first time in a long time? What about going to Dreamland? What about going to the legal seafood? I heard they've got fresh lobsters and oysters from Maine. What about going to the movie tonight? What about going to the movies? What about having another drink? What about having dinner with me? What about having mulligan chances in every hole? What about her lover? What about her new address? What about her whining and her constant need for attention? What about him? You remember him? What about him? I don't know how to talk to him. What about his calls for genuine democracy? Again, they were spurned. What about his listed home address? What about his personality could possibly attract you? What about homework? What about Hurt Locker? The reviews are great and the trailer looks good. What about ice cream then? What about if I put it in here? What about if Mama found out? What about if we bypass this just right over there? What about if we make a bargain? What about if you forget to feed your dog? What about if you had children? What about illegal or controlled substances? What about in cairns? What about inviting the Smith family? What about it? What about it? What do you want me to do? What about joining yourself? What about Jonathan? Is he okay? What about just being a patient on the NHS? What about karaoke tonight? What about keeping conversations going? What about leaving things behind? What about letting me go, man? What about male cosmetics? What about me, don't I look good? What about me, he only had one lunch today? What about me? What about me? Came a plaintive voice. What about me? You just said I could. What about me? You need to take care of Duke. What about medicines? What about Mr. Parker? What about my bags? What about my copier? Can you get it going again? What about my diet? What about my privacy after my flat was ransacked? What about my travel expenditures for food and lodging? What about next time I'm in town? What about next year? The trading climate will be tough. What about other countries? Do they have similar campaigns? What about other days? What about our guys doing it? What about our protagonist? What about fishing? What about picking four? What about picking another question? What about playing real games outdoors instead of playing virtual games indoors? What about pre-existing conditions? What about putting our heads together? What about riddles? What about rising blood pressure from binge drinking? What about Rome, Athens, and Istanbul? I like to deepen my knowledge of history. What about are you? He's waiting to take me back. What about Sally? What about Sammy, is he ready, too? What about Saturday night? What about send her a letter? What about sending hearts to fans now? What about some coffee? What about some of these lemons? What about some tea? What about something else? What about something to drink? What about something to eat? What about something to nibble on? What about Sunday, you think that's enough time? What about swimsuit models or even actresses? What about syllable limits? What about taking a walk? What about tax? What about taxes and the cost of land? What would be the effect of a move on them? What about 10 o'clock tomorrow morning? 10? What about that three-piece suit? What about that cute guy I met? What about that money you drew out? What about that one monkey you told me about? What about that one? What about that slave cleaning the dock? What about that thing he did when he tipped the guy who showed us to our seats? What about that thing? I won't tease you. What about that? What about that? Look at it. What about the Simon Says game? What about the ABM treaty and arms control? What about the address she used on her passport application? What about the bathroom and the dining room? What about the bathroom and the dining room? Do you want them painted, too? What about the bean sprouts? What about the blood test you were talking about? What about the boat I'm supposed to meet? What about the bullying outside of classrooms? What about the car? What about the coordinates? What about the corners? What about the day after tomorrow? What about the down payment for the house we're gonna buy? What about the element we discovered? What about the ending? How does it sound to you? What about the fact they seriously outnumber us? What about the female model? What about the fighters who are covered in tomato pulp? What about the food? Is that important to you? What about the girl we hit? What about the girl? What about the girls you fired? What about the global response could be improved? What about the health risks? What about the Hong account? What about the house you got? What about the letter I found? What about the light you saw? What about the little boy's room? What about the lost purse? What about the man you arrested? What about the man you were fighting with? What about the material that we submitted last week? What about the money I've spent? What about the most common type, Arabica? What about the new post-2005 World Bank? 2005? What about the next 3 days? 3? What about the next train? What about the nutritional value of frozen food? What about the orders I asked? What about the other 3? 3? What about the other alternatives? What about the others? What about the pedestrian that was hit? What about the people we killed? What about the people you've murdered? What about the phone I got? What about the probe we sent through? What about the probe we sent? What about the rent? What about the rest of the waste after it has been treated? What about the rest of the world? What about the rest of you? What about the roads, they are black? What about the science fair? What about the second minister we meet with? I kinda liked him. What about the secret project she had mentioned in her sick room? What about the semen we found? What about the songs we wrote? What about the songs you write? What about the stuff you said? What about the style? Were you thinking of a perm? What about the surgery he's talking about? What about the teeth you had taken out? What about the theater? What about the things she knew? What about the things she said about me? What about the tickets? What about the training program? We'll have to over that until next week. What about the way he's holding that stethoscope? What about the way you act? What about the wide-eyed cat? What about the work of Edward Bernays? What about the working is finished? What about these candle holders? What about these cute keychains? They're only $1 each. 1. What about these foods? Fish, poultry, and eggs? What about these pants for Dad? What about these pants for Dad? They look pretty sharp. What about these parts over here? What about these, Frank? What about these? These look the same? Definitely. What about this flying bat guy? What about this Friday at 2 o'clock? 2? What about this furniture? It's fantastic, isn't it? What about this movie? I recommend this movie. What about this one? What about this one? What about this one? This is the best one we have. What about this one? You know it. What about this optical illusion you slipped me? What about this position appealed to you? What about this Wednesday? What about this whole story that it's a bodyguard? What about this? What about those stubborn poison ivy cases that jewelweed doesn't soothe? What about 3, the missing bullet? 3? What about tomorrow night? What about tomorrow? What about tracking down his son? What about trying that new Chinese restaurant? What about Tuesday night then? No, not Tuesday. I'm working until 9:300 p.m. 9. What about Twitter? What about us having little dinner Saturday night? What about us, what will we do? What about us? No passion, only complaint. What about using a special alarm clock? What about voice talk? Will she pick up? Voice talk. What about walking home? What about walking? What about weekends? What about what happened to that little girl? What about what he said about the drugs? What about what she would want? What about what they did to the people at the resort? What about what we do for you? What about what you said at the hospital? What about what you said 2 weeks ago? 2? What about what you said under the bridge? What about what's happened in Ireland and Iceland? What about when I do this? What about when I kissed her? What about when I take off? What about when I'm trying to get you out of prison? What about when it grows up? What about when we get back? What about when you kissed her? What about when you were alone? What about when you're angry or upset? What about when you're together? What about Wrigley Field? What about yesterday and the day before? What about yoga? What about you in this respect? What about you stopping with me? What about you work for me? What about you, do you pray? What about you, Joe? Do you like football? What about you, ma'am? What about you? What about you? Ever thought about having kids? What about you? How come you use the sign in photos? What about you? Hey? What about you? Saturday is my day off too. What about you? What's your day like? What about your breath? What about your brother? What about your 11 o'clock meeting? Should I cancel it? 1-1. What about your eye, you know? What about your foot? What about your home? What about your job? What about your manners? What about your mother? What about your nose? What about your savings account? What about your search for the men that killed your family? What about yourself? What about? What about, I don't know, something authentic.